So what did you say?
So again, I think the big issue here is that this is the biggest fight back that the country could have marshaled against this particular pandemic, this economic fight back. And you must keep in mind that what we are starting off with here is a country that was already, faltering economically. And of course, when you then have a global economic shutdown that obviously then affects a country like South Africa even more acutely than perhaps countries that are in a stronger position, we're always going to ask the question of what it is that we can do in order just to mitigate against the economic fallout from this pandemic. And I think what we've seen today is as far as the government believes it can go in order just to try and keep some parts of the economy going. The key problem, of course, is that what makes the South African economy unique is that it's still a world of two parallel economies. There is a small thing that qualifies to be referred to as a formal economy, the people that are part of the tech space and people who are fortunate enough to have jobs. And then you've got the rest of the population that unfortunately doesn't have employment opportunities and also depends on the state just to be able to live from month to month. So this is the first time where you're really trying to then find a solution that caters to both those binaries and to say this is a social solidarity compact where everybody has to be assisted in one way or another. So it is definitely much greater than any initiative that we could have ever imagined this government would ever do. So obviously a lot of people are now asking the simple question of where did the money come from?
Yeah, so that's what I was about to say. For me, top line, I was just like, 500 billion. Because the whole time we've been talking about a country that's broke. We said we didn't have money to fix ESCOM. We said there was no money to, build social housing. We said there was no money to, look at restructuring banking and finance. We said there was no money for the land project. We said there was no money. All of a sudden, 500 billion.
Yeah, so, we're not going to discount the fact that your maths might be dodgy, but I think the key issue here is that in all of these particular initiatives that the government has had to come up with, it's really a question of you might have what we refer to as a conservative stance in your fiscal policy, which is to say, yes, there might be 10 rand on top of the table, but unless there is somebody starving, we're not going to spend it today, we'll wait and see what the situation is tomorrow. So you've got a very conservative government. So the money might be there, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you must use it simply because you always have to wait for a particularly rainy day. So what you've seen here is that you've got this universal rainy day where the answer must be, you need to be able to ensure that people aren't dying, not only from the pandemic itself, but also from just the inability to be able to have a loaf of bread because you've said to them they must stay at home. And as I said earlier on, in the type of economy that we have, there's a lot of people that are outside the formal economic structure whose only ability to be able to generate an income is linked to their ability to wake up and go and hustle in one way or another. So I think for me, the biggest illustrations of that particular economy is what I refer to as the undocumented economy. So in South Africa, if I wake up and then I have somebody who comes into my house to do some work, then I don't go and fill in an employment form because it's a once-off transaction. So those are the undocumented. So you also see when you're driving around, there's people maybe on Saturday mornings that are saying that I can do plumbing activities, I can do these types of activities. So that undocumented economy is a big part of our ecosystem. But also the fact that they're undocumented means that all the initiatives that you heard before, when somebody talks about tax relief, when somebody talks about UIF reliefs, those are the things they believe are always part of the structure. So if you've never had a job, then for you these things are foreign. And the one thing I was dealing with when I was speaking to some guys in Durban last week on the phone. Hello. The reality that some people have now discovered that they've been working for a very long time. So you were working for a hair salon or for a restaurant, but that hair salon or for a restaurant would pay you on the basis of how many heads you can treat on a day. So now they've never contributed anything to something called the UIF. And now they heard that that if you're employed and you're suddenly being laid off during this lockdown, you can go and make a claim only for them to be told that they've never actually been heard of from that particular system. So we know that is these gaps in really the entire economic architecture. So you wanted to be able to come up with a package that is all-encompassing, that doesn't discriminate against people on the basis of the historical economic position that they've occupied, because here you've got a pandemic that doesn't discriminate in terms of race, class, or ability to earn an income. So it's simply saying to all of us, we are literally locking you down until maybe we find a cure. So it was always the big challenge for government to say, how do we actually reach out to parts of our economy that we've never reached out to before, because somebody would have said, well, the resources simply don't exist. And I think obviously there is an appetite within the state to say we need to do something, but also it means that the type of social partners that would have previously said, no, we're going to hesitate to assist here because we do not understand the state's capacity to do these things. We do not trust the state in its capacity to do these things. They've all had to make a U-turn and say, well, this is the type of situation where previous or pre-existing anxieties have to be suspended because we've got a much bigger problem to solve here. So I think we need to reflect on that. Now, whether obviously it gets run properly, it gets administered properly, is what we're going to have to monitor on an ongoing basis. But I mean, this is 10% of the country's GDP. That is a huge number by any stretch of the measure.
Yeah. So one of the things I'm interested. One of the things I'm interested in, both you and I are, we work in finance, we're finance professionals. When you're in finance, they do that, remember that whole old calculation of source of funds, application of funds, right? So what is the source of this 500 billion? Where's this money going to be coming from? Is there going to be an increase in taxes? Is there going to be an increase in PAYE? And one, and two, how is it going to be applied? Because the issue you're talking about, specifically about people who are in the undocumented economy, that issue still persists. That issue hasn't gone away. So how are they going to do verification of who gets what, number one? And number two, this for me is probably the major issue. How are they going to make sure that this money gets into the real economy? I've been talking today with some entrepreneurs, some who are in our portfolio that we're invested in, and they're all going, we applied for this UIF thing. It's the 20-something today. I've got a month in to run at the end of the week in terms of salaries. But the money that they said was in the UIF that we've applied for hasn't come through yet. So there seems to be a lethargy in the system. So I suppose I'm saying three things, but the one I'd like you to talk to more specifically is, where's the money going to come from? And two, how do you think they're going to get this money to the real economy?
So the source of the funds is from multiple sources, I would put it like that. When we talk about the internal sources, we do have a lot of dedicated funds in the country. And when we speak about dedicated funds, this is something that Pravin Gordon and I used to argue about a couple of years ago during Fees Must Fall, in that you may set up a fund for a particular purpose, and that fund then has a particular way of collecting its income and then distributing its expenses. And the unemployment insurance fund is one such example. So everybody who is part of a particular payroll contributes at least a monthly amount. I think it's capped at 148.72 into this particular fund. The most remarkable thing about the unemployment insurance fund is that it has a surplus. Now, the interesting thing about how the UIF has a surplus and how other funds don't have a surplus is that the type of people that tend to contribute to the UIF are people who actually never make withdrawals from the UIF. So if you have somebody who's got a very well-paying job, they will, when they're earning a salary, be contributing to this fund. But when they migrate, they're migrating in between jobs rather than them migrating from having a job to jobless. So a lot of the biggest contributors to the UIF actually never get to use it, which is why it's the one fund that is in a position to be in a surplus. If you compare that to the road accident fund, for example, the road accident fund has got an unlimited and an unknown as a liability, because whenever you hear about road fatalities, that is an expense for the road accident fund. But if somebody says, there were 15 people in a taxi, for example, they were in an accident and 15 people lost their lives, that doesn't mean that 15 people who were contributors to the road accident fund are now going to be, essentially creating a withdrawal from the road accident fund. So it's a very differently structured system. And of course, unfortunately, it's not in a position to be financially sustainable, simply because the question of the money that comes in versus the obligations that the fund then has to honor are quite simply not able to be, structured in a way that makes it solvent, as you may call it. So the UIF being the one fund that actually has a huge surplus, of course, government is going to utilize it because this is a rainy day. A lot of people would come back and say, well, the fund was set for a particular purpose. And if that purpose is not what we're dealing with here, then it shouldn't be used. But I think this is when the government has to step in and say, we wrote the mandate of that fund, and we said that it would assist people who've contributed before, who are now no longer employed. So therefore, that's what it should be earmarked for. But I think no one is going to fault the state in this particular instance in saying, well, actually, that mandate needs to be expanded for the purpose of us doing this particular intervention. So that's the one source. There's also obviously the external sources that you do know that the IMF in particular does have some funding. The World Bank does have some funding. You can always go and borrow money. It's always the question is never whether you can borrow the money, but whether you can be able to borrow.
And on terms which fit your national agenda, right? Because that's a big problem.
That's the important thing. But whenever people talk about the national agenda, always say, well, the national agenda should be, you shouldn't be getting yourself in a position where you need to borrow money in the first place. Because
sure.
The tensions that get created is that people then say, oh, but these people give us, unfavorable terms and conditions. But again, you're the one that approaches them. So if the national agenda is completely averse to this idea of borrowing from these agencies, well, don't put yourself in that particular position. Nevertheless, here we are in that position. And I think what will be quite important is to then look at the type of conditions that come with these types of assistance programs. And if those conditions themselves turn out to be problematic in the long run, we need to sort of at least be aware from inception, because at the end of the day, in desperate times, you're probably going to sign up for the type of conditions that you otherwise wouldn't have signed up for anyway, but then you don't have a lot of other options. So there's definitely going to be parts of the lending conditions that are going to leave a lot of people feeling a bit uncomfortable. But then what is the alternative? And if the alternative is that you don't have funding and people are not in a position to be able to eat the next day, that's a type of decision that comes with being the president of the country. So luckily, I would never be such a person. So good luck to Mr. Ramaphosa. But those are the type of things that he now has to apply his mind to.
So 500 billion rand is what he's committed. Some of it, in terms of the conversation you and I had earlier, some of it is definitely, it's soft money. It's not real money in the economy. So it seems as if he's taking liquidity, because a lot of people don't understand the cascade effect. 2 or 3 weeks ago, the Reserve Bank reduced, they reduced the amount of money that banks needed to hold in reserves based on Basel III. And then the second thing they did is they reduced the rate that they charge banks for the interbank transfers. And there was big criticism at the time, people going, well, that's not real money in the system. All you've done is you've made banks more liquid and therefore given them more capital. But banks will still have to lend it using exactly the same credit criteria. But if I understand what he's done today, by basically saying we're going to allow the banks or use the bank's balance sheet to shore up the real economy, what that means to me is that those reductions and give and takes that he's given to the banks cannot be pumped through into the real economy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, so the fundamental difference, and unfortunately far too many people never take the time to look at the difference between what we refer to as monetary policy interventions versus the fiscal intervention. So whenever you refer to the Reserve Bank is in the territory of what you refer to as monetary policy. And unfortunately, the biggest problem you have with any monetary policy interventions is the time lag between action and effect on the real economy. And when people want the real example is that if the Reserve Bank says we're reducing interest rates by 1% or 5% or whatever many percent it is, it simply means that people that have pre-existing borrowings, pre-existing exposures, get that benefit of them having to pay less at the end of this month. In the South African context, you've got 12 million people that are unemployed and could never qualify for any form of loan from a bank anyway. So already that 1% will never reach those 12 million people because they do not have those pre-existing exposures to begin with. And then the second is that there would also be the reality that you, as I said, we have this binary situation where people at the top are people that will say, well, actually, even if you reduce the interest rate by 1% or 2%, I don't have a cash flow problem, so therefore I'll simply just keep it there. So I'm not going to take that additional cash that I have and then spend it on hiring someone or spend it on acquiring something else. So the transmission mechanism associated with money interventions is the biggest limitation, as it were. But of course, Reserve banks only have that as part of their arsenal. If somebody wants to then give them additional instruments, that's a secondary question altogether. So the ability of the Reserve Bank to intervene on an immediate basis within the real economy, quite simply, is limited by the way in which they do things. Now, what we saw today, this is more of the fiscal policy stance, where the government actually can be able to then say, we had budgeted for building a school in 3 or 4 years' time. So the budget is there, so that money is earmarked for that particular project, but we've decided to redirect it into hiring an additional nurse tomorrow. So you can already see that particular action translating to consequence immediately, which is what a government is uniquely positioned to do. But then again, that requires them to have money available.
But there is also, there's another question there, Khaya, which is for me a big concern, right? And the question is this: we're making a lot of plans right now and provisioning capital, which is necessary. I've been one of the people going, we need the government to act sooner. We need them to do more, right? But I think there is another question here around what is going to be a systemic and a structural risk for our economy. And here's what I'm saying. I don't expect that beyond lockdown, the economy is just going to tick back up. There's definitely going to be lethargy in the system. I was trying to explain this to my son, my oldest son, and I was like, it's a bit like switching off a factory with massive turbines. If you go into the factory and you switch it on again, the turbines don't just start kicking in at full capacity. There's a speed that they're going to go at, and it takes a while for the turbines to get into full capacity. Then you've got to feed into the system whatever the turbines are churning for them to give out the output, right? So I think our economy is going to go through something very similar. After this, there's going to be massive lethargy to get it to kick again. That means, for me, the way I see it, there's going to be a fall in government revenues, but government has already committed all of this money that they're expensing, and then there's going to be a question of, so you've expensed this money, you've taken on the expenditure, you've used up the reserves and funds that are sitting there. Now, there's the revenues are not coming through in the real economy. And I'm looking, I keep saying the real economy because that's where I work. Over the past 2 weeks, I've probably been on 10 phone calls with different CEOs and MDs of businesses that employ a minimum of 5,000 people. All of them considering the option of going, actually, no, I'm just going to close. I'm not going to put up with it. I'm not going to go through this. I'm not going to, and for a lot of these guys, you understand it because they're saying the South African economy over the past 2 years wasn't performing already, Vusi. And I was already shoring my business up to keep it alive off the back of this national agenda. Now there's this thing going on. I don't see how we're going to, so my concern is whether or not our economy is going to have the revenues it requires beyond this to sustain it and to tick back up again. And whether or not people are going to still be gainfully employed beyond this so that we can get those contributions back into the tax base, into the PYE. I think, again, to your comment, I wouldn't want to be in Cyril's position because I think there's so many different elements moving that he's got to consider that it's an invidious position for anybody to be in, right? A quick question for you, right? So what do you think in terms of their ability to help and stimulate SMMEs and the informal sector? Because that's really, I think, where our people are going to feel it the most.
Look, I think the South African problem is firstly our ability to understand what SMMEs are doing out there. And I think what we've been seeing a lot, I've been seeing a lot of these this week where you get a call for people to say, okay, I'm an SMME in this thing. So everybody's saying, okay, we are looking for SMMEs that do this and that. And I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, this is the type of database that we should have had as a country in the first place. Because if you understand and you acknowledge the role that SMEs play in really being the engine drivers of the economy, it is for me quite problematic that now, even in this particular crisis, the Department of Small Businesses has absolutely no idea how many SMEs do, how many SMEs we have, what do they do, and where are they located? Because had that data been available, it would be much easier for them to be able to say, this is the type of intervention we're trying to put out there. We know where they are, we understand what they do, and this is how you can put structured interventions to actually assist them. So again, even the SMME space is also itself suffering from regulatory, I think you might want to call them the lack of formalization, where people quite simply do not know how many qualify for which type of incentive. So that's an ongoing problem.
Sorry, it's what I don't want to cut you off. It's what I call a single source of truth. The problem with our SMME, which is exactly why our government has battled with policy, they battle with deploying funding, they battle with identifying growth sectors, is because there's no single source of truth. So it depends who you talk to. If you talk to CIFA, you get one answer. You could talk to CEDA, you get one answer. Department of Small Business, you get one answer. SME Fund, you get one answer. Everybody's got a different answer because everybody has a different definition, and everybody's going out there collecting their own data rather than going, let's collaborate and coordinate so that we can get to the single source of truth. But sorry, I cut you off. The second point you wanted to make.
Yeah, so you're definitely right in that the information is a fundamental part of this conversation, because had that information been readily available, then most of the interventions would be rolled out at a much faster pace. And I think right now we're all learning what the issues are, and unfortunately it simply means that there's a delay in implementing the type of initiatives that the state wants to put out there. And I think obviously after this, we'll be in a much better position to at least understand what the ecosystem is, because it is now forcing us to really document what our understanding of our economic architecture is, and what are the easiest touch points that when you make one particular intervention, the multiplier impact is maximized. Because giving a rent to me versus giving a rent to you may not necessarily generate the same economic benefits depending on what you and I decide to do with that particular amount of money. And I think us having a much more intimate understanding of where the low-hanging fruits are, what are the type of businesses that require immediate support. And that's also a policy conversation, because I could give you a rent and then you go and buy one particular machine that's so specialized in nature, it hires 2 or 3 people. Somebody could give me that same amount, and then I decide that I'm going to invest it in a type of business that employs 5 or 6 or 7 people. It could be a restaurant, so I'm doing well on the unemployment score, but you're probably doing well on really generating the type of product that can then be exported. So it's really a question of, in your policy orientation, what do you want to prioritize? And of course, in the South African context, there's absolutely no doubt that you need to prioritize the avenues that have the greatest capacity to employ people. And whether we've now identified what those avenues are, whether we've identified which companies those are, I'm not particularly sure. And I think you keep hearing people do understand that the tourism sector, for example, the agricultural sector, for example, have got the greatest capacity to stretch that one rand to as many more beneficiaries compared to me trying to hire someone who's an actuary, for example, because that's an expensive resource and it's one individual who has multiple skills. But then what was the question that I was trying to solve? Was I trying to deal primarily with the employment crisis, or was I trying to deal with maybe just getting the high-level skills to be much more prevalent in the economy? So again, it's a policy question that governments have to deal with, and that's always an ongoing conversation. But I don't think anyone can dispute that in the South African conversation, you must prioritize each sector that has the capacity to achieve the greatest employment, absorption of people who are outside the workforce, and also the retention of those people. So of course, cyclical jobs also create particular tensions, because I'm employed for 3 months, off the job for 3 months, employed for another 2 months. It's disruptive, and it really doesn't get you the type of social outcomes that you're trying to get to.
Okay. Finally, I just wanted to get a sense from you around, so, you know, you and I had the conversation offline about SAA probably about a week ago. You know, it seems like that boat is sinking. And that's probably, you know, that's fait accompli. Sithole today came out saying they're selling a minor stake in the Lake Charles project to try and shore up their balance sheet. Everybody's aware of the issues at Eskom. So what I'm saying here, and I don't know why, you know, I add Sithole to that list because it does have a historical link with the South African government. But it seems to me that the SOCs, whether you believe in the SOC model or not, and I have my own theory about what a developmental state needs, and I do think a developmental state needs state-owned companies, because I think the role of state-owned companies is to artificially lower prices that create an environment where trade can happen so that people can build businesses affordably, right? That's the way I look at it. You know, one of the things I've been really concerned about is the number of people who are joining the unemployment queue, what's happening at SAA, SA Express. And I think what people don't understand is the ecosystem effect. So you and I both know this. At SAA, cutting 4,700 jobs, 5,000 jobs is a problem. Here's the bigger problem. How many people work in companies that supply SAA? How many people work in companies that make components for SAA? How many people are supported by the livelihoods of people working? You know what I mean? Like, there's a massive, I think, economic cascade effect there that's going to follow. And I have not yet had an opportunity to think clinically about whether or not the government can afford to keep some of these state-owned companies based on what are now competing priorities. And I think one of the gifts for Tito Mboweni, actually, which is interesting, because I think Tito's job was made simpler by junk status. I think a lot of people actually don't appreciate how junk status made Tito's job simpler. And I think the reason it made Tito's job simpler is because there were people in the ruling party who didn't share his ideological point of view, who all of a sudden they don't get the benefit of a voice because you're in junk status. So the guy now has to make emergency decisions, and he doesn't have the same burden of extensive consultation that he would have in the past. What do you think of that?
You're putting me in a corner here because Tito might then be unhappy with my views. Look, the SAA example, it's an interesting one. I think I wrote an article about it a couple of weeks ago about the bargaining power of the incumbents versus people that are outside the room. And it was in the context that when you are talking about decisions relating to one entity, you tend to amplify the voices of the people that are directly employed or directly involved in that particular conversation without actually understanding the effect on the entire ecosystem. So if you're talking about SAA, for example, and the question of whether the 4,700 employees will have jobs afterwards, you and I might do a calculation and say, look, 4,700 people, they might be redeployed in other jobs, or whatever the case might be. But for a person to end up being on a flight, an SAA flight, to be served by one pilot, or whatever the case might be, that person has made a contribution to so many other parts of the ecosystem before they even get to the airport. So for me, it's a matter of SAA. If you want to evaluate, don't look at it as a standalone entity. Ask yourself, how do you actually evaluate the economic impact of this? Now, I must confess that in my profession as accountants, we tend to prioritize the question of, tell me what's happening in this particular balance sheet. So there isn't anything called a value chain balance sheet, for example. So if you were talking about a value chain balance sheet, I would then argue that, well, when you're talking about SAA, talk about the aviation value chain of the country. You've got a company called AXA. So what happens when AXA no longer can charge fees to SAA? You've got a company called ATNS, which is the Air Traffic Navigation Service. What happens to them? The problem with the government is that it spends so much time splitting and scattering these entities all over the show. No one can actually do a detailed calculation that then says, look, in the SAA conversation, we do have a problem, but this problem is then it transcends just the SAA conversation. It also links to these other parts of the economic conversation. How do we then deal with them collectively so that we know what the way forward is? And I think the problem is that we have a very poor understanding of how economic touch points work together. So when you then take decisions, it's always from a rather myopic question of what do I think works for this entity, but these entities aren't standalone entities, and they shouldn't be seen as standalone entities. They're part of a much bigger value chain. Now, obviously, the conversation has probably been tainted by the fact that even that business on its own probably hasn't been run properly. So it's difficult to defend SAA as a standalone entity. But perhaps had somebody said, I will run SAA properly on the understanding of what it means for the entire economic value chain, the conversation might have changed. But from what I'm saying now is that the SAA conversation has just gone become far too complicated and far too toxic. Because a lot of things that are non-business related that have been done in and around SAA, which is very unfortunate. And I think going forward, we then need to be able to ask ourselves the question, what happens when we don't have a particular airline of that scale? Do we have other people that come in and replace it? If that's the case, then there is no problem. Can another airline come and employ as many of these people that are going to be displaced as possible? If that's the case, then there is no problem. But I think unfortunately, the way we evaluate these things after the liquidation, if it happens, nobody will know at that point in time what happens to those 4,000 people. And in the country where you have an army of people that are getting close to 15 million, according to some estimates, of people that are already unemployed, and it's going to get worse after this crisis, then you have to look back and say, what can we do differently?
Yeah. Bafo, ngiyabonga Job and Fish.
PAYE, brother. People are asking about that because you brought it up.
Well, I mean, I'm happy for you to explain it because the question.
But you brought it up.
No, I mean,
you brought it up.
Because somebody on the comments made a comment around what the president said on PAYE. Did he say anything about PAYE? Did he say he's going to be reducing the levels? Is he going to be taxing more? What's he going to do?
The biggest issue around PAYE is that there is a misconception that PAYE is another tax. PAYE is not another tax. So what PAYE is, it's actually a collection method for personal income tax. So what happens here is that if you actually go and read the Income Tax Act, I think it's Section 4, it simply says there shall be levied and charged on an annual basis an income tax. So technically, a person's tax year ends in February, and at that point in time, we should be working out your taxable income and saying this is your tax bill. That's really what the Act says. However, they then introduced a schedule, which we call the fourth schedule, that then said, okay, in instances where people are employed, for example, what we'll then do is that we're going to do the collection of that tax bill on an ongoing basis, which is a monthly basis. So the very concept of PAYE says that when you are earning, you will pay taxes as you are earning. But at the end of the day, you actually still have a one standalone tax bill. So that one standalone tax bill, we'll work it out, we'll calculate it and say, oh, Vusi should have paid 10,000 Rand during this year. But every single month, Vusi was paying 1,500. So it either says that Vusi has been overpaying or Vusi has been underpaying. So the key issue here is that because we are forcing you to pay on a monthly basis, it means that there is obviously a cash flow implication. Now, what companies then have to do is that they have to then say, Vusi's salary for the month is 10,000 Rand. Of the 10,000 Rand, 2,000 Rand is the income tax that we're supposed to collect and pay over to SARS. Okay, so what this PAYE concession is saying that, well, whilst companies are supposed to pay this amount over to SARS every single month, we might then reduce the amount that is due. So instead of your business or your employer handing over the 2,000 Rand immediately to SARS at the end of April, they will then say, no, they only need to hand over 1,500 because we now understand that if that 500 remains within the business, then at least the business can cover some of these unexpected costs that have been created by this coronavirus thing. So I think there's a misunderstanding here because firstly, PAYE is not a standalone tax. It's a collection method for income tax itself. Now, what we're simply saying is that even though the company is supposed to take from you the 2,000 Rand and hand it straight to SARS because it's not their money, it's money that you are paying to SARS, but you're using them as a conduit. Even though that should be paid over in full, we will consider saying that actually they can delay paying a part of that. And I think that's where the 35% conversation came from.
I understand that, but that's interesting, right? Because there's so let's say, for instance, my business takes up that. So on my balance sheet, that's going to be sitting as a liability due for whenever they remove this concession. Is that the case?
Yeah, it will be a liability, but also more importantly, there is cash flow within your business. So then it will mean that it will cover some of these costs that, otherwise you would have to go and borrow money. So it's really a temporary concession. It really doesn't affect the fact that at the end of the day, all of that amount will have to be due to the state. So that's really the important thing here. The other one that he mentioned is that the holiday on skills development levy funds. Okay, so that's yet again another ring-fenced fund, and I know Pravin Gordhan particularly hates ring-fenced funds because we used to have these debates around it. So the UIF is a ring-fenced fund, so because it's supposed to be used for a particular purpose. The road accident fund is a ring-fenced fund because it's supposed to be used for a particular purpose. So similarly, what happens is that every single month when you are earning a salary, then we take 1% of your salary and then we refer to it as a skills development levy. And that amount then goes into what we call the SETAs, the Sector Education and Training Authorities, because they're thinking, and this was a good thing from back in the days involving NEDLAC, Labour and government, the thinking was, in the South African context, you've got this unique situation where I might be lucky to have a job, but so many other people do not have a job. So I should be able to then take some part of what I'm earning and then invest it into the skilling of other people, the upskilling of other people. So that's really what SICAs comes from. So every month, if a company's got a payroll of, I think, about 500,000 Rand, then the 1% of that payroll number then goes into these particular funds. So obviously for big banks and for big corporates, we've got like multi-billion Rand salary bills and multi-billion Rand payrolls. That is a significant number, right? Again, the other important thing about this is that some of the SITAs are very, very solvent. And if you want to understand why it's the conversation we used earlier on around the UIF, so if you think perhaps of Bank SITA, so Bank SITA would have a lot of people that work in the financial services industry. Those people, they earn much higher incomes than other, maybe the agricultural SITA people. So of course, what will happen is that Bank SITA would have a lot of funds in there because 1% of a 1 million salary is a significant number. And again, remember that people that make these contributions to the SITAs end up not using them because for them, moving from a 1 million salary, you're migrating to another 1 million salary. So they never come back and say, oh, by the way, I need help from that SITA because they quite simply do not need the help. So you've got some SITAs that are very solvent on the basis they work in a sector where the salaries are much healthier, if you want to call them that. And then the other SITAs will perhaps the industry doesn't have a high wage profile, so therefore, obviously, for them, their solvency question is very different. What the president has then said is that for the next 4 months, that 1% that you are being forced to pay to the SITAs, you do not have to pay it. Again, this is money that is remaining within the business, so then the business can say, instead of firing Vusi next month, we're able to put together the sum of this 1% savings that we don't have to pay over to the SITA and be able to keep Vusi employed for the next 3 or 4 months. So those are really the type of concessions that have been put forward today.
But thank you, man. I mean, like I said, I was sitting and listening to this thing, but my brain was fried, I think, because I've been reading board packs and proposals and putting together, financial structures and cap tables and a whole host of things. So I just didn't have the capacity, and I thought you'd be the best person to help me and then therefore help my listeners. I appreciate your time, Bafu.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much.
Thanks, man. Take it easy, boy.
Bye.
Cheers, bye.